Well, I think of my work as always been abstract because I wasn't trying to represent reality. The fact that photography needed a real subject, a real thing, and yet what that thing was had no representation. It was that relationship that interested me. So it brought up a lot of questions about what is it I'm really trying to say, or not so much say in a didactic way, but what is it, what discoveries can be made in this abstraction? My name is Barbara Kasten, and I guess I'd call myself multimedia artist, even though most of my early work was photography. I've now branched off to doing a lot of different things. Well, I didn't come from an artistic family. I came from a very middle-class family here in Chicago. I was fortunate enough as a young child in lower level school and grammar school to have a teacher who took an interest in me. And she was an artist. And when I was younger, I was more interested in painting. And so in school, I painted a lot until I got into college. I was at the University of Arizona, where we had moved from Chicago to Arizona for my father's health, and I finished my university level schooling at Tucson. And for grad school, I applied in painting, and I wasn't accepted in painting. And I was in Europe at the time, and I was seeing a lot of exhibitions on crafts, this was in the 60s and 70s, so there was a renewed interest in art, craft as an art. I knew about Magdalena Abakanowicz, and I followed, those sorts of tapestry directions. And so when I came back to the States, I applied for admission to California College of Arts and Crafts. And at the school, there was a woman named Trude Guermonprez who had just started a program in fabric and textile design and sculpture. She was trained at the Bauhaus, so she had a very free idea about textiles, and so it suited me, and I happened to get a scholarship there to work with her, and she was a big influence on my life, on my discovery of the Bauhaus, and through that, my discovery of Moholy and his affinity to photograms, which was the basis of my practice, really. Well, I've always been interested in construction and assembly, and architecture is part of that. But the fact is, I never thought of becoming an architect, or if I did, I don't think I would have actually had the ability to do that, because there weren't very many women architects in my day and age. But I grew up in Chicago, and I had architecture all around me. I think all of those things affected how I constructed things. And I think that it all is reflected in the way I put things together. Instead of building something that's so permanent that you can't change it like an architect does, I build things that have nothing to hold it together. It's all in the principle of balance and weight. And sometimes when I make these assemblages and they kind of collapse, on each other because there's a little bit too much tension going on, that's when the material speaks to me. But when it came down to actually making art with the photographic process, I discovered the photogram, and it was through study of the Bauhaus and Moholy, and I was married by the time, and we were living in LA. I was teaching fiber and constructions, which I then wanted to show the students how to make a three-dimensional form in the way that I did it. And so I found this fiberglass screening material. And it's actually a material that I started making photograms with in 1974. But I also made other wall forms with it, which is some of the work that you see behind me. And they were done in 1974. And recently I kind of reconstructed some of them. So that material appeared in almost everything I did since then. But it was the first photogram and the first photographic part of my career. Well, the material, for instance, the fiberglass, was a very practical one. It was actually an industrial material. I loved going into hardware stores and any place that I could discover something new that wasn't part of my world. And when I found this fiberglass, it's actually material made for window screening. So it's a very utilitarian purpose to that. And it has a stiffness, but a flexibility. So there's this combination that you could still manipulate it, and yet it held its form that intrigued me. And so when I discover a material, I really like to find out what its properties are, what it can do, and how much I can intervene with that and change it to do something maybe that it's not meant to do. The photograms, the silk screens from 1974 that I made with those, turned out to be ephemeral, beautiful, silky, gauzy photograms, images that kind of make you think of the sky or the sea or water. And yet here it is. It's this raw, stiff, strange material that holds bugs out of our windows. When I first started making photographs, which I did through the help of Polaroid Studio and Polaroid material, because don't forget, I'm not a photographer. I really don't like the dark room. I have no interest in all the chemicals and the magic of the dark room. My magic is in the studio with lighting. It's just a kind of experimenting long enough with a material where you discover something new with it as you change the intention for it. I think I do that with mostly all of the material I use. The fluorescent plexiglass that I've used more recently was a signage material that people used to make advertising signs. That was before digital. That was before all the LEDs and everything. And it had a certain quality to it because I knew it had a transparency and it had a color and it had beautiful, intense color. But the best part of it is that somehow, because of the way that it's made, the light travels over the surface and sort of accumulates on the edges. So you get a transparent flatness, but you get it outlined by bright, colorful edges. And that's unique to that material. Light's the essential element, because without the light, you don't have shadows. And shadow can be another form. It can be in depth. It can create space, negative space, positive space. So the idea of using a spotlight on these three-dimensional constructions that I made in the studio was essential. That's my discovery of magic. Architectural sites was another step into installation, I think, more than sculpture, or maybe both. But I was making these studio constructs using mirrors and color lights, and a friend of mine wrote an article about postmodern architecture in the 80s at the time. It was the 80s in New York. And I also was seeing all this new postmodernism coming out with Michael Graves and Philip Johnson and all the architecture in New York. And so Vanity Fair had contacted my friend to write an article on the postmodern atrium, the space that, you walk into that's impressive and huge and overwhelming. And he wrote to that, and I then became involved when he invited me through Vanity Fair to make photographs of it. So the setups I used in the studio became what I photographed, only I used the real buildings as part of the sculptural aspect. And I inserted mirrors so that if you were experiencing this huge, enormous space, this mirror would also reflect another part of the space into the frame of the photograph, so that you had a multiple experience, sort of like a collage but a three-dimensional collage. And that's how that came about. For instance, the High Museum, image that everybody seems to really love, it's a horizontal one with basically the Bauhaus colors of red, blue, and yellow, with this huge triangle intersecting into the space and a reflection of a young girl in a statue in the image, in this sliver of mirror. And that whole building was white because Richard Meyer, who was the architect, that was his trademark, was white. But I love to disrupt things. And I think it was a little bit of a feminist jab, like, I think I'll change your white building to something colorful. So it was a combination of things like that, where I really wanted to have something to say about these massive structures made by men, and I could go to it in an unusual way. I could get to it and make a comment through the photography. So that's how the architectural sites got made. They were supposed to be published with this article. Well, it never happened. Vanity Fair replaced it with some, I don't know what was going on at the time, but something that was more not newsworthy, but probably more extraordinary, more attention-getting. decided I needed to talk about abstraction more, and to to look for a different kind of materiality that's not based in color. So I started using clear plexiglass, and because through the clarity of a sheet of plexiglass, you can see the other side, you can see more objects. But the fact that it's a physical presence of matter, it also creates a shadow. So I started on a series, it's called Studio Constructs, that where I basically photographed through plexiglass forms and use the shadows more as the content of the work. And in the process, it became more abstract because there was no recognition of a representational object. It was just sheets of plexiglass and shadow. And in that way, I also feel that abstraction is a political tool that people don't recognize or give credit to, because they think of abstraction as design and color and lines and geometry. But I'm using it in a different way, and it makes you wonder, and bring your own interpretation to what you're seeing in a photograph that is real, and what isn't real, and what you're making of that situation. And here's where the light is so important, is that light is what is not there all the time. So as soon as the light enters into the configuration, it becomes something so abstract that you can't pin it down without that light and that experience of light. Well, how can it be political? It can be political by opening people's minds, by allowing them to have their own free expression of what they see and what they believe they see. And maybe in some small way, I don't say it's, political in the same way as the political stance that much art takes today, but it's political in a opportunity for people to express themselves and to see and believe in what they see. And I think that's the basis of a political statement, really. When I put together this mesh of grids, and I could see what the shadows did, they went backward into space. They created a depth. And what I wanted to do was to bring that depth forward. And a painterly way to do that is to use the surface of the painting. So the print that's made photographically, digitally on the canvas, it's actually raw linen. I wanted that raw linen to be a negative space, but to have a character all its own, not just a void. And so it's in your face that this is actually a real fabric, and yet the image thrusts you forward because I've made it kind of at a steep angle and to purposely make you go backwards into it. So again, it's playing with the forward and the backward of my position as the artist, because that's I'm still doing my dance in front of the camera and behind the camera. I love opposites. Sometimes I'm a very ornery person and like to stir it up a bit. And so these two very different materials appealed to me. Blue is a very spiritual color. It's referenced in many artistic efforts, from poetry to painting to film. It's a symbol of spirituality. I started out with making photograms. I've made a lot of photograms through my lifetime. Actually, I'm not sure if people have ever counted, but every so many years, it seems like I have to make a body of work that's a photogram, because it just feels so right to me. And so during this shutdown that we had during COVID, I have a backyard. In the summer, it was beautiful and hot. And so I went back to the photogram. But I had this grid material in mind, and it's a plastic that I used to lay on top of raw linen that I painted with cyanotype. So you had this sort of off-key, off-color cyanotype, never the true blue of those very early cyanotypes, but one that was muted and kind of just changed what the fabric looked like, changed what the cyanotype looked like. And I thought, well, how do I bring this also out of the depths and into the real world? And so I thought about putting the metal on top of that. So not the metal that was used to make it, but the metal that I felt was in proportion to the grid that I was recording in the cyanotype. And again, it's about space, because I placed the grid away from the surface so that that space in between was just as important as the surface of the metal and the illusion of space that came from the cyanotype. So I think I was building from the center out in both directions with these pieces. And then I lit it, and once the light hits it, you get another layer because you get the shadow. So I was able to sort of expand and create a dimension that was very ephemeral, but, and it had to rely on the light. It still has to rely on the light. It's an interesting object, but it doesn't become alive until the light really is part of it. I feel like I'm in an experimental lab sometime where, a new discovery is a new material, or an accidental discovery. Sometimes it's very accidental that I see something happening only through the lens. I don't go in a direction that I plan for. I might think of a direction that's interesting to follow through on, but where it goes, and I pick up on what it happens. Sometimes it's closer to my idea, and sometimes it's a completely different idea. But it is sort of the spirit of what I do. It's kind of like needing to really find out what exists, why it exists, what it's meant to do, how I'm meant to interact with it. And it's a very personal thing.